98.6% of globally managed assets are controlled by white male-owned firms. So it's that ownership piece. What I like to say as an allocator and portfolio manager is who puts 98.6 of anything into one portfolio?
Welcome to System Catalyst, the show that cracks the code for making the world a better place. I'm your host, English Saul. Today, I am joined by Kate Caldwell-Nevin, the president and portfolio manager of TSWII Capital Advisors. Kate has over 2 decades of experience helping decide where money gets invested, from startups to larger companies. She's working to change the financial system by supporting new and underrepresented fund managers who don't always get the same access in the industry. Kate, welcome to System Catalyst.
Thank you, English. It's great to be here.
We're so excited to have you. I'm curious, Kate, I want to start off by hearing a little bit more about you and your background. What got you into this field? Have you always been fascinated by finance and wanting to put money in these different places, or how did you get to where you are?
Right. I'm sure, like most people, it wasn't a straight line. And to be completely honest, when I left college, I actually thought I would end up being a novelist. So I moved to New York to write the great American novel, and then quickly wondered, how in the world does someone pay rent and have fun in New York City while also trying to be a writer? Like, those things didn't connect. And it was funny, a good buddy of mine from college was like, well, why don't you just interview on Wall Street? You're smart. You took some business classes. Like, give it a shot. And I did. I ended up joining as an analyst at Hueman Brothers, and I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed that experience and what I learned. And I think coming as an outsider from the beginning, without sort of this framework of I want to be, an investment banker, I want to be a trader, but really kind of falling into it and going, this is interesting, right? Like, how can I put my own perspective on what's happening here, and where does that lead? So it's been an interesting journey since, because it was like my life sort of took this interesting left turn in New York, and I found myself on Wall Street, and then really never left. And I was fortunate enough to join prime brokerage and capital introductions team at Hueman Brothers, which worked with hedge fund clients. And so really my early days were built around alternative investing, which to me has always felt like a very dynamic, very interesting place to focus in terms of the financial industry. So I was lucky to kind of fall into that seat early and have stayed in alternative investing since. Clearly, there's no more Hueman Brothers. I might have stayed until it was gone, but it was ultimately 9/11 that pushed me out of New York. Really reframed, I think, I guess the silver lining was the reframe of what's important to me and what's the career track I can build for myself. And so ended up finding my way back south much earlier than I thought, and have been able to really build my career around a life that I have really enjoyed living here in Charleston, South Carolina, and made it work. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love Charleston. I think last time we talked, I was telling you my dad and stepmom live down there. So
right.
I get the privilege of coming to visit, which is it's so fun.
It's so fun.
So Kate, I mean, this field that you're in and that you entered into, I mean, I don't think it's a secret that it's pretty male dominated.
Yeah.
What has that experience been like for you, especially, given that sort of you came from even kind of like just this, what I would consider just a more passionate, like arts-driven background,
right,
into this very male-dominated, more financial sector. And then now what it feels like you're doing is just like combining both of these things of your passion, but also the amount of just like financial savvy that you have to carve and chart a new path.
Yeah.
So what has it been like trying to do that kind of in more of a male-dominated sector?
It hasn't always been easy, just to start with. I'll say it hasn't. I mean, there were lots of times when I felt like internally, like my moral compass or my passions or the creative urge inside of me, the part that really thought deeply about, my values and things that mattered to me, often felt at odds within the world that I lived in, right? Which was very, I would say in particular, hedge funds were, very, especially at that moment in time, very, very male dominated. So to be honest, it wasn't always easy. In those early years, showing up at conferences, I was typically one of very few women in the room. And I know a lot of women can also share that story. That in and of itself doesn't make it unique, but it did at times just make it feel a bit lonely in terms of building, community with people. But I think what really helped me was the fact that I didn't come into this industry with this kind of maniacal, very limited focus on, I studied business, this is what I do. I came from this sort of more creative world of imagining different outcomes, right? Of existing in a world where you can create your own destiny, or asking different questions on like, well, why is it this way, right? Or how could we change this part to be more effective, right? To reach more people. I guess I came to this industry, which tends to be very transactional, very black and white, with a bit more of a personal ethos that was more around imagining the ways things could be, right? How can we build more reciprocities into the system? Who's missing from the system? Who's not around the table? So really, I think that willingness to think outside the box and really find my people that way was quite helpful early on, and then continued to kind of inform and support the trajectory of what is now a 25-year-long career, and continuing to kind of build, my core peer group, which is a great mix of women and men, and deep thinkers, and just, why I could not say no to you in this podcast, like system changers, right? Like, let's think about how we can do this better, right? It's not that or differently even, right? Like, what are the other options here? Because there are so many. So I think really being able to bring together my creative life, my community life, my really values-driven life, and over the course of becoming more and more confident as an allocator, as an investor, as a seasoned thinker for alternatives, like the ability to merge those two just became so much easier as my career progressed. And now I feel like I'm sitting pretty comfortably in a seat of, let's think about how we can create change inside of a system that up to, really recent time has not thought too strategically around how to better serve underrepresented managers or diverse perspectives. And I think that window has opened a bit. Sometimes I feel like the door starts to close and I'm like kicking it back open. It's always the push-pull. But for me, it's passionately where I sit today, is how do I use all of this traditional exposure and time I've spent in the alternative markets as an allocator? How do I use all of that to reimagine what it could look like, right, for the next decade, for the next 3 decades, for my daughter's generation? Like, how can we take the system and, improve it? Like, who doesn't want to improve things? Yeah.
Well, so I'm wondering, at what point did you start to realize that the system that you were in wasn't really serving, marginalized fund managers, specifically women? Like, when did you start to connect those dots?
Yeah. I would say really sort of around the sort of mid teens, I really started to come in contact with more sort of quote unquote impact investors, and really started learning that, you can, given that we have been really focused more on traditional, just a traditional portfolio focused on, outperformance of, and targeting market rate returns and all of that. Like, it really began, my eyes began to open by some of the early data around, quote unquote impact investing, around achieving market rate returns while also having social impact overlay, or more broadly, a solution-oriented portfolio. Moving beyond sort of like these sort of screens or exclusionary investing, but really thinking deeply about how to invest more in solutions that, by nature of being successful, scale and then create that return profile you're seeking, right? So I started really spending more time in that world in the teens. More as just education, more as just learning from peers that had actually been really deeply embedded in impact investing. And that was really enlightening to me. And then when I took over as president of TSWII Capital Advisors, and we're majority female owned and majority female staff, like, it really became almost a logical next step to think about how can we put this sort of female forward and or new perspective of sort of some of my deep dives into more broadly impact. How can we think strategically about the ecosystem of women in more broadly the entire world of alternatives, from hedge funds to venture capital to private equity, like really thinking about what does that talent pipeline of fund managers look like? How can we more broadly build a pipeline that supports diligence on these managers, that supports community connectivity, exposure for these managers? Because as I began digging sort of more into my theory of change, which is, I think if women controlled more capital, we would see a lot of our impact and philanthropy work a lot better, just period. Like, that's something we haven't tried, right? Women controlling more capital in the system. And as I began to peel back the layers from that, it really became a quest of, well, where are all the women, right? What is the investable universe look like right now? And how can I help build out more connectivity there, more exposure there, given my insights in this space and working with alternative investment managers my entire career, right? So how can I use my skill set to elevate a sector that I think more broadly has not been elevated in a way that they should? Really just became almost like the joy of my career once I totally stepped into that, right? Like, really became such a wonderful community and connective tissue to build inside of the system. That really, the harder I worked, the more fun it became, because I was learning and connecting and really, I think more broadly sharing with my network and my peer group and cultivating more community around, talent that I felt like really wasn't being focused on enough.
And so correct me if this stat is outdated, but in the current ecosystem, is it true that like 98% of the capital that we're talking about is controlled by or dominated by white men, are making the decisions on where that capital goes?
Yeah, no, that is, it's crazy to say that out loud, but that the Knight Foundation unearthed a lot of that when they looked at globally managed assets, right? And I think the statistic is 98.6% of globally managed assets are controlled by white male-owned firms. So it's that ownership piece. And again, I've been investing in white males my entire career, right? And there are a lot of white males that, like, this is not sort of I think a condemnation against that. But what I like to say as an allocator and portfolio managers, who puts 98.6 of anything into one portfolio? Like, why we all, I mean, that was, I think that report came out maybe in the late teens and then was updated again, I think in 21. I'm not sure what the most recent mark is for that percentage, but it hasn't shifted much. But when that first came out, like it was just like a bomb dropped on me. And I was like, that is crazy. Like, whoa, this has got to mobilize us. We got to throw some spaghetti at the wall. Like, this doesn't make any sense. And it was kind of crazy because I felt like it was kind of like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I'm so glad that you actually asked me the question in the way I like it framed, because mostly when people share that data point, they say, 1.4% of globally managed assets is controlled by minority and female-owned firms. And so like when we talk about it in terms of lack, I think people are like, oh yeah, they just, it's always the, less than 2% of venture, it's always this sort of low, single digit number. And people have become accustomed to hearing that. So I love that you said it the opposite way, because when you say 98.6, you're like, that's crazy. Like, seriously, who would expect that things would function properly when we've got only one perspective really calling the shots? So for me, that really became like almost like the beat the drum on there's opportunity here, right? To improve the system, and not at the expense of another, but elevating and including more diverse thoughts in that just around that table and in terms of who controls all the capital. So
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering, based on your experience and what you've seen, where have you witnessed some of these kind of structural barriers that have led to this lack of diversity of thought and diversity of decision making?
Yeah. I mean, I wish it wasn't so, but I'm going to start at the very beginning with just the inherent bias in the system. And I bump up against that every day. I do feel that there is that just exists. So I'm just going to put that out there. It's there. When I think about the funding flywheel for women, like I sort of see this circle, right, of capital moving around the system. And I think about all the different on-ramps for that capital. And I think where we've seen dollars get more activated, there's still a ways to go, but where we've seen a lot of traction is in women and angel investing, right? And really getting some capital into the system that way, which I sort of think about as like the first on-ramp. So in 2003, I think when Golden Seeds was started, women only represented about 5% of angel investors. Now I think that number is 35%, right? That's incredible, right? I think if we could move lots of these metrics to more in the 30% range with women, we'd see a lot of transformation. But it became like, okay, so we've started to move some capital in there. What's the next on-ramp? And that really became fund managers, right? And more investors showing up as LPs into female fund managers, and how important that is as part of the system to provide scale and ultimately liquidity to some of these early investments in the angel space, right? But once you get to the fund manager seat, it gets a bit harder. So I often see that women can take what was a really strong angel investing portfolio and turn that into a fund 0 venture fund or a fund 1 venture fund and build out that way, right? So there is definitely a cost to setting up a venture fund for sure, building out the infrastructure, the teams, all of that, and pulling this more through the system into a GP role. The larger the venture fund gets, the harder it gets, I think, especially for women, right? So we see women in a lot of earlier stage venture funds. And not to say it's not there. I mean, we have really spent over the last 5 years a lot of time, like I said earlier, building out this talent pipeline. So we have over 1,600 funds in our database that are at least 50% owned by women. And it's fascinating to see that the vast majority of those really are in venture, right? So I think women have stepped into sitting into that venture capital manager space. And I think there are some good support systems there. When we go further, maybe up into the capital structure to private equity or other hedge fund strategies, it gets even harder when you think about setting up a fund and setting up your compliance and registering with the SEC. And it becomes the cost to really build the infrastructure you need gets more it's difficult, right? It's not impossible, but I think it's difficult. So that's where we see some of this, I think, more structural barriers is it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, right? It takes money to build a fund, especially to build an institutionalized fund, to have all of the C-suite you need if you need to register with the SEC. I mean, there's so many complexities around doing that. We see a lot more with fractional these days, which is great, right? It's becoming pretty common to see fractional CFOs and all of that. So I do see there are really compelling ways to kind of build a team that can scale as you grow. But by and large, it takes significant assets to really build out an institutionalized fund. And so I think sort of the first thing we've recognized that's not really flowing to the extent to which it should inside of the system is just that first layer of capital to women, right? And the fund managers. So I'd say and then the bias kind of plays into that. But I do see really it's more broadly that access to capital, which becomes the biggest issue.
And there's something that you said that I want us to go a little deeper on. And there's a difference between allocating capital, like being a fund that funds women entrepreneurs, or that funds or gives grants to women leaders, and women actually being the decision makers of capital allocation.
Yes.
Tell me why that distinction is important and why it is so important to have women as capital decision makers and capital allocators.
Yeah. I mean, that is, I think, a crucial component of what is more broadly called the multiplier effect. And we are actually working on a report to put out later this fall called the multiplier effect that's really pulling apart a lot of the pieces of what you just asked. Why does it matter so much that you see women controlling the capital as owners at these funds, in these seats? And more broadly, it is things like, well, they're controlling the investment program, right? They're building the team and the culture. I also often say, I love to see women as owners, but I want to see really diverse org charts, right? We don't want to see the pendulum swing the other way. Like, I think magic happens when we have differentiated perspectives, lived experiences, sector experience, all that around a table, right? Young, old, black, white. The more diversity you have around an investment program is a more rigorous, collaborative portfolio, ultimately, I think. So that the data really supports that, just sort of foundationally at the level that women-owned funds that have, really defined the culture and the investment program and built these diverse teams, those are the ones that tend to produce the stronger returns. And then I think inside of so putting venture kind of aside for a minute, because we see a lot of women represented there, I also think why it matters when we move into sort of areas like private equity and hedge funds is, again, more broadly thinking about just the diversification of those asset classes and what it means to have more women managing large firms in a peer group, which is more broadly male at this point, but really elevating what can change inside of some of those cultures. Definitely get a vibe sometime that hedge funds are really bro-y, and have talked on occasion with some of our, super talented male hedge funds, and asked them about like the opportunity to pull more women in as analysts, as portfolio managers. And oftentimes they talk about how hard that is. And I think that's because we still have to change that culture. And so, I always love to see when there really are more women coming onto teams, because that's where they learn. That's where they really understand the rigor of trading, in public markets, and the deep analysis. And, we tend to sort of focus on more fundamental investing. And it becomes a who was your mentor. So it's so important that these women get pulled in and are able to be mentored. And then that allows them to hang their own shingle and build diverse teams. So I see it almost as, yes, it's important, one, because of how they build the culture, how they invest, what they invest in, even things like the benefits they provide to the team, right? All of this creates interesting knock-on effects. But inside of industries that are a bit more quote unquote male, real estate, private equity, hedge funds, I think just having more female managers be successful there and visible there starts to change the culture itself from the inside out, which is the way it should be, right? Based on performance and fund execution, and really building an institutionalized investing program. So I do spend, the bulk of my time looking at the pipeline of talent in those sectors, sort of, yes, in venture, but also beyond, right? Let's really make sure we're building up a strong talent pipeline across the private equity, more later stage, and then the hedge fund and other more liquid strategies. So that's where I spend the bulk of my time, because I think that's where the most interesting opportunity for change and more broadly scale can happen.
I think one thing too that I know that we've talked about before is, women, there's a big wealth transition that's taking place.
Yes.
And a lot of this is money that has, been made over the past however long, mostly in the hands of white men, being transitioned into the hands of their daughters or their wives or their granddaughters. And we see this, slowly starting to move in that direction. But one thing that is also noticeable is that the majority of these women who are on the precipice of these different inheritances, they still have a lot of male wealth managers. The field of wealth management seems very male dominated. How does that enter into your world and your thinking of, well, we may have women who are becoming more and more like decision makers upon for their wealth, their advisors are still most likely to be a man?
I think there's been a lot of celebration on LinkedIn and at some of these large wealth advisory platforms around, this great wealth transfer and all this money. I think it's like the number keeps going up, but I think it's sort of around like $120 trillion, with about 70% of that expected to fall into the hands of women. And isn't that amazing? And, if you go behind that headline, for me, I'm like, it could be amazing. It could also just calcify the status quo even more if those women aren't activated and motivated to think strategically about where that capital will be deployed. Because if it does just flow to the advisors, or another what I call sort of the gatekeeper on the assets, right? If they don't have a framework for investing around generational change, or investing more in women, or in solutions, or in, quote unquote impact, or I like to say values aligned investing, right? Then that transfer didn't really do anything to elevate dollars going to women. So what I think could be really exciting this day and age, and really what we're thinking about in terms of a report we're putting out this fall, is this dynamic of the great wealth transfer, sort of the rise of alternatives on investment on wealth advisor platforms. Also, a lot of the trends we're seeing that women and next gen are much more interested in investing in values aligned. So if we can find a way to really elevate the discussion with these gatekeepers, with these advisors around how to help your client achieve what it is they want to achieve. Like, let's not default to the standards if they're coming in with a request to really do something different with this capital. I have heard stories of women that go to their advisor and they're like, I'm really interested in this fund. I'm really interested in investing in more women. And, a lot of times they get a pat on the hand and go, we've got this covered. Like, just don't worry about it. If you want to, do something with your angel investment portfolio over there and invest in women. And so for me, like, my real passion is how do we get advisors activated on women, investing in women in particular as part of a total portfolio. Not this little carve out that sits over here, but what's happening with this total portfolio and what's the gender diversity of that. So I think it's like kind of it's definitely a multi-pronged approach for any solution out there. But when I think about the Venn diagram of what's happening with all of these forces coming together, I think it has to be educating women to have the right, maybe it's 3 questions for their advisors. Like, keep it simple, right? I think change gets unlocked with just a really good question. You don't have to have all the answers straight away, but maybe the question is, I would really like to see more women in my portfolio. Can you, on our next meeting, have a breakdown of the gender makeup of all the managers in my portfolio? And can we take a look at that? It's not saying right or wrong, or I want to do X, Y, or Z. It's just like, let's do an audit of where my money is invested, because I would really like for it to be invested in more women, or thinking more strategically about energy transition or what have you, right? So it just becomes that opening question of, let's do this. Can you help me? And I like to remind women in particular, like, that's what you're paying your advisor for, As part of our research for this report I keep mentioning, we did find a statistic that said something like 83% of Americans don't think their advisor has their best interest at heart. And that's crazy to me, because that's who they're paying to manage their money. So it's like, okay, well, then let's find a way to help your advisor help you achieve what you want to do. And or if they don't, let's find you someone who can work with you and help you achieve that. So what I hope is that given these tailwinds, we see, whether the advisor is male or female, that when these women who have now, through this transfer received additional funds into whatever the vehicle is, that they help these clients really find more of a bespoke way to activate these funds. Because I think if we just keep going with the traditional, we're missing a real opportunity as this capital flows through the system. So, I like to say I don't think it matters as much whether it's male or female, though we do need a lot more female advisors in the system. I think McKinsey maybe, and I don't have this data in front of me, but I think McKinsey did a study that said, given the incredible amount of this transfer, we actually don't even have enough advisors to support a transfer like this. Just there's so much money and potentially even more investors coming into the system that we really are short on advisors. So for me, it becomes like, let's find more ways to build pipelines for young women to become advisors. And I love to see teams that are really doing that very thoughtfully, very strategically. Let's get more women sort of in every seat along sort of the allocation of capital component. But I do think it becomes, how can we help everyone, whether it's an advisor or a client that works with an advisor? How can we really help provide awareness, education, connectivity, case studies around how to do this better? Because what I see is a system where the incumbents aren't really incentivized for change. I kind of see a system where it's better to fail conventionally with the typical funds. We all know their names, where all the capital goes, and they're seen as like the safeties. Like if one of those funds does poorly, well, everyone else is using it. It's not a big deal. But then you take a differentiated approach on a client's request to do something much more dynamic with a fund manager that isn't yet a household name, with a more diverse fund, something that's really, I think a strong fit, but it is still deemed maybe a risk for that advisor. So sometimes we see these incentives aren't aligned. So I think it is more broadly almost like an awareness and an education campaign, and really building up more connectivity for advisors to ask questions and to do diligence and to do more research on dynamic funds that fit what their client's trying to do. Because I think it is a push-pull, and the more information we can get into the system on both sides will be really helpful during this transition.
I really like the way that you said, how do we think about getting more women and diverse talent in general along every seat of the wealth allocation continuum?
Yeah.
I think that that's a really deeply systems change goal that will lead us to diversification of thought, diversification of allocation, new opportunities that we haven't even been able to see yet. So, Kate, on this podcast, one thing we do as we're wrapping up is sort of ask our guest what question or thought they want to leave our listeners with, just as they're listening to this podcast, maybe on their commute home or something like this. But I want to ask you that question and one other one, which is, where did you get your glasses? Because I've been admiring them this whole time, watching you, and I just think that they're so cool. So
thank you.
That's my other question. But
love it.
Maybe you could text me the link.
I'll do it. And it's so funny. I'll answer that one first. My, I believe these are from C, but my real glasses broke. And so I got these as my backup. And then I started wearing them on Zooms. And this is like the Zoom accessory, right? Is what everyone has from like the neck up. And so everyone's like, oh, I love those glasses. And I'm like, maybe my backups are my new regulars. So thank you for that.
Love it.
Another vote for stick with the backups. And then the question, I think, I want for people to ponder as they listen to this on their ride home or on their walk or on their travels. I really want people to think about what their theory of change is these days. I feel like we, especially for the women listening, I feel like we should a lot all over women. You should do this, you should do that, you should do this. I think it really starts with what is my theory of change in the world? And then from that, what's the execution of that theory of change? Because you can tie everything back to that question, and it becomes a much more productive conversation with an advisor, with a family office executive, with a partner, with a colleague. My theory of change is we need more capital in the hands of women. And I've built everything else sort of in, my world to support that. And it's become a driving force of how I see the investment world and how I build our pipeline and portfolios and also like the peer groups. So I think a lot of interesting things can come out of a really big and broad question of just what is your theory of change? And once you have that, maybe start picking at the follow-up questions on what that looks like and how to build that out. But I guess I'd leave with that.
That's amazing. Kate, thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation. I can't wait to read this report.
Yes.
That you're talking about. And we'll make sure maybe when it comes out to link it in the show notes here so people can check it out too.
That'd be wonderful. English, thank you so much for asking me on. I'm really glad you're elevating these conversations. There's so much opportunity for systems change. I am so excited to see lots of positive things happening in the world below the noise. And you're one of them. And so thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kate.